much for joining us tonight for this very important conversation. I am Stacy Walker with New Canaan Cares. I'm the Education and Program Coordinator, and we are joined with Anne and Nakia from the Domestic Violence Crisis Center. A little bit about New Canaan Cares and how we came to bring this program to this evening. In recognition of Domestic Violence Awareness Month, we have partnered with the Domestic Violence Crisis Center for this important discussion. The mission of New Canaan Cares is to advance the health and well-being of youth and families. CARES provides responsive educational programs and professional development that support and strengthen parenting skills, positive youth development, and healthy lifestyles. The vision of CARES is to empower youth, strengthen families, and build community. With that in mind, we at CARES feel it's important to have the discussion about domestic violence because it truly impacts the entire family, and as a community, it is crucial that we are equipped to respond when we find others in these difficult situations. With education comes empowerment. Empowerment builds strength, and strength in our community can create change. So I would like to introduce Anne Rodwell Lawton. She is the Director of Programs and Quality Assurance at the Domestic Violence Crisis Center. Anne earned her master's degree in social work from Hunter College with a concentration in community organization, planning, and development. Anne has been in the sexual and domestic violence prevention fields for over 8 years and has extensive knowledge of primary prevention programming. Previously, she was the Director of Education Training and Outreach at the Women's Center of Greater Danbury. Prior to graduate school, Anne was a community educator at the DC Rape Crisis Center, where she conducted child sexual abuse prevention presentations. In her role at DVCC, Anne oversees evaluation efforts and community outreach and education programs. And joining her is Nakia Ellis, who has been with the Domestic Crisis Center for 2 years as a prevention educator. So we are thrilled to partner with them this evening. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping items. You will be able to see us. We will not see you. You will not be able to talk, but we can communicate via the Q&A at the bottom of your screen or the chat function. So thank you. Ladies, over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Stacey. We are so excited to be here tonight and to partner with you during Domestic Violence Awareness Month. As you were talking about New Canaan Cares vision about strengthening families and building communities, I think that really aligns with what the Domestic Violence Crisis Center is about. We want to build safer communities, and we want individuals to have safe relationships within their families. And so we're really excited to partner with you all. Thank you for inviting us. I'm going to share my screen right now for us to get started. Thank you. I see people are already using the chat feature. Great. And thank you for letting us know who you all are. That's wonderful to know who's in the room. Okay. 1 second. Okay. Can everyone see my screen? Give me a thumbs up. Okay. So our program today is called Domestic Violence 101. Every house is not a home. And before we dive in, I want to give you some background on the Domestic Violence Crisis Center. People also refer to us as DVCC. At the Domestic Violence Crisis Center, we help and support individuals on their journey to safety and healing. And we do that through offering free and confidential services to victims of domestic violence. We offer a wide range of services, including individual and group counseling. We also have a legal advocacy team that advocates for victims within the criminal and civil justice system. When there is a family violence arrest in one of the 7 communities that we serve in Lower Fairfield County, one of our victim advocates reaches out to the victim to explain the court process and to advocate for their needs within that criminal case. We also have housing and financial advocacy. We know that housing and finances are often a barrier for victims to leave abusive relationships. And so we have a department that specifically focuses on working with victims in those areas. We also have a 24-hour hotline that is available via text or call. And we know that it takes a lot of courage for folks to reach out for support. And so we want to be available 24/7 and are available 24/7 for when someone makes that courageous step to tell their story and to reach out. We also have 2 emergency safe houses for parents, adults, and children who are fleeing violence. I see there's some questions in the chat that we'll get to. Okay. And we'll wrap this up. We also have youth preventive education programs, and we believe that youth deserve to have the knowledge and skills to navigate healthy relationships. And so we have education programs that focus on prevention and focus on healthy relationships within for teens and youth that can focus on conflict resolution, empathy, and learning boundaries. Great, lots of good stuff happening in the chat. So our outline for our time together is we're going to start by talking about domestic violence and defining it. We're also going to talk about the impact of COVID. I'm sure people have been hearing about domestic violence being on the rise since COVID has happened. We're also going to talk about the different methods of control that abusers use, the impact specifically on children, and how people can help. We're spending a lot of time at the end talking about what we can do as a community. Okay, and I'm just going to switch my mode real quick because it looks like you are all in a different mode and you're seeing a different thing than me. So just give me 1 second. Okay, that's what I want. Okay, so that is our outline for our time together. Always helpful to know kind of where we're going and kind of the arc of our conversation tonight. And also before we dive in, just a reminder to take care of yourself during this time. We are obviously going to be talking about domestic violence. This can be overwhelming or upsetting, particularly for people who have experienced their own trauma in the past. And so please take care of yourself during this time. That can look like making yourself some tea while you're listening to the presentation, maybe cuddling your cat, or thinking through how you're going to call a friend afterwards to process this information. We recognize that these are difficult conversations. These are difficult things to talk about, but the first step in preventing domestic violence is talking about it and raising awareness. So we appreciate you being here tonight.
All right, so we are going to just jump right in and talk about what domestic violence is. So we're going to start off with the definition of domestic violence, or another term that people use interchangeably is intimate partner violence, or IPV. But basically it refers to a pattern of abusive behavior in a relationship that is used by one partner to gain or maintain power and control over another intimate partner. So I want you to look at that definition again, and I just want to highlight the 2 key words, power and control, and just keep that in mind throughout the presentation. All of the things that we are talking about is basically one person gaining or maintaining that power and control over their partner. Now, when we think about domestic violence, probably the image that comes to mind right away is some form of physical abuse, right? Hitting, slapping, kicking, restraining. But there are many different ways that an abuser can maintain that power and control beyond just physical means. They can do it through verbal, emotional, we said physical already, financial, technological, or sexual abuse. And in a little while, we will do some interactive activities to really break down each definition of these methods of control. But I do want to highlight that there's more than one way that an abuser can maintain that power and control. I also want to point out that in the state of Connecticut, in a court of law, it is only the only crimes of domestic violence that can be punished in a court is if you assault your partner, if you threaten your partner, or if you stalk your intimate partner. So even though we know that financial abuse can be devastating in a relationship, or emotional abuse or technological abuse can be very damaging to that person, unless it specifically involves assaulting, threatening, or stalking your partner, that is the only way that it can be punished in a court of law. So it's a little frustrating sometimes when we see that and we know that a relationship is abusive. However, there may not be anything that can be taken to court. However, I do want to highlight that even in the cases where there is not a crime present that's punishable in a court of law, we still have all the resources at DVCC to help victims that are suffering from financial abuse or technological abuse or verbal emotional abuse. So even though it may not be a crime in the eyes of the law, we still have the resources, and we still know that it has a huge impact on victims. So that's domestic violence in a very brief nutshell. We also want to talk about, when we are talking about domestic violence, we want to talk about relationships being on a spectrum. So in this next slide, we just created, I will get to that in just a second, but I would love to hear more about this, Senator Sersons. But relationships fall on a spectrum from healthy to unhealthy to abusive. And it's important to recognize that abusive relationships just don't pop up overnight. No one just wakes up one day and decides that they're going to abuse their partner. It's going to be a pattern of these unhealthy behaviors that makes the relationship abusive. So it's going to be a buildup of these events and not just one single culminating event. So it's important to recognize that it's hard sometimes for victims to see that the relationship is becoming unhealthy and into abusive territory, especially if they are really in love with that person. It may be hard to spot those red flags, but thankfully we host workshops like these where we can break down what a healthy relationship looks like versus an unhealthy relationship and learn more about those red flags before that relationship enters into abusive territory. Okay, so I want to see this. Jennifer's Law. Actually, I did just read about that. Absolutely. Anne, are you aware of that as well?
Yes, and our executive director, Suzanne Adams, did write our local legislators and representatives to talk about the importance of Jennifer's Law and expanding the definition of domestic violence. So it is something that we are aware of and understand why expanding that definition is beneficial for victims. Thank you for bringing that up.
Yes, absolutely. And in a little bit, we will talk more about ways that abusers will manipulate, the family courts and custody situations as a form of abuse. So thank you again for bringing that to our attention. Very nice. Okay, so I just want to share a couple of statistics with you relating to domestic violence. So it is estimated that 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men in the United States have experienced physical violence by an intimate partner in their lifetime. And we thought that this statistic was important to put in this presentation, because often when we talk about domestic violence, we think of it as just a women's issue, but domestic violence has no boundary. It doesn't care what your gender is, what your sexual orientation is, what your race or socioeconomic status is, what your religion is, what your ability status is. Anyone can be impacted by domestic violence. So we wanted to also highlight that 1 in 7 men experience physical violence. We also know that domestic violence is the leading cause of homelessness for women and children. And that is why part of our programming at DVCC is to is to have emergency shelters available for families that are fleeing domestic violence situations, so that they have options and they aren't just going to be put out on the street if they are trying to seek safety. We also know that growing up in a home where domestic violence is present is the strongest predictor of a child becoming either a perpetrator or a victim of domestic violence later in life. And another great program that we have at DCC is our prevention education program. So we are very much aware of the statistics. So we do everything in our power to combat that by going into schools and teaching children about healthy relationships. So even if they are witnessing domestic violence at home, we are giving them the tools to have healthy relationships and healthy communication skills, healthy conflict resolution skills, so that when they are an adult, they don't become a perpetrator of domestic violence, nor do they become the victim of domestic violence. Okay.
Okay, great. So now we're going to talk about a little bit about the impact of COVID. It'd be remiss of us to not mention this. I'm sure most of you have heard stories in the news, read articles about an increase in domestic violence due to COVID. And so we want to talk about that and some of the dynamics that we've been seeing. First, why has there been a rise in domestic violence since COVID? Well, there are a few factors that are probably coming into play. We know that abusers may seek to increase control in their relationships when they feel like they're losing control in other aspects of their life. So for example, many of us are feeling like we don't have a lot of control over our lives with a public health crisis. Well, for an abuser, that lack of control in one part of their life, they may then increase control in their relationship or another part. We also know that being stuck at home with an abuser creates dangerous scenarios for victims and their children. We were told to stay home to stay safe, but that's a very different reality when it comes to domestic violence. With COVID, we were also told to stay home to stay safe and to isolate, to not see many people. And for domestic violence victims, that can also be dangerous because we know isolation is a tactic that abusers use to cut victims off from their support systems and for people who can help the victim and support them. When we look at research also indicates that domestic violence typically increases during times of a national crisis or a community crisis, or when families spend a lot of time together around the holidays. We did see an increase in domestic violence incidences during the financial crisis in 2008. We typically see it after natural disasters. So all of these things are impacting this increase in domestic violence due to COVID. What we have seen at the Domestic Violence Crisis Center is that our clients are in need of more support and help with COVID. They have increased safety needs, are in need of more safety planning and support. We've also seen an increase in the amount of counseling and advocacy services per client. We also have seen an increase in basic needs like food security. And with the court system being closed, the Stanford court was closed till June. Norwalk court is still closed. Services are happening virtually, but many victims were very concerned about the standstill in custody matters, in divorce proceedings. And so COVID really has had an impact on victims. Okay, like Nakia said, we are going to be talking about the different methods of control. We like to use the phrase methods of control instead of types of abuse or forms of abuse. All of them are correct, but this is a reminder that this behavior is based in power and control, like Nakia said. It's important to recognize that most domestic violence abusers do not have anger management issues. That is a myth that we hear. As a society, we say things like they just lost it or they snapped, and makes us think that there's an anger issue. But the root of it is someone wanting to have power and control, right? So abusers control when they abuse, when children aren't around. They control how they abuse in ways that they won't be caught, or leaving bruises where they won't be detected. So again, all these behaviors are based in power and control. We're now going to do an interactive part of our program with polls. And so just give me a second to pull this up. The poll will come right up on your screen in a second. And these polls are interactive and to help us process these methods of control. Okay, so this first one is launched. Hopefully you see it on your end. This is a true or false question. Sexual abuse cannot, let's do this one. Sexual abuse cannot occur when the two people involved are married. Is this true or false? I'm gonna wait for a few more folks to answer this poll. So again, the question is, true or false, sexual abuse cannot occur when the two people involved are married. Okay, we're going to end polling and I'm going to share the results. They should come up on your screen. Everyone said that this was false and this is correct. Wonderful. So let's talk about this. Sexual abuse is any sexual activity that is done against someone's will and without consent. And so sexual abuse can happen in any kind of relationship, regardless of the status of that relationship, whether people have been dating for a few weeks or have been married for multiple years. And sexual abuse can be done through force or coercion. So when we think about coercion, that can be pressuring someone to engage in sexual activity, saying things like, well, if you really loved me, you would do this for me, or I deserve this. And so recognizing that sexual abuse is not just when force is present, when someone is coerced into any unwanted sexual activity. Okay, we're going to do another poll. This is, that is the same poll. No, it's not. There you go. True or false? Physical abuse always leaves a physical mark. Okay, a few more folks will give you, waiting for some more folks to answer. Okay, we're gonna share the results. And everyone said false. You are correct. Physical abuse does not always leave a mark. So when we think of physical abuse, we often think of hitting or pushing or behaviors that physically harm someone's body that would leave a mark, but we really want to broaden our understanding of what constitutes physical abuse. Physical abuse is also the threat of physical harm. So things like object aggression, if someone throws an object across the room, even if someone steps out of the way and they're not physically hit, it's still that threat of that physical harm. We also see victims talking about being restrained or cornered. So limiting someone's physical space would be physical abuse. And we also see reckless driving as a way to instill fear, fear for one's life and for their safety. Is reckless driving. And so for those examples, that's not touching someone's body, but is still physical abuse with that threat of that physical harm. With COVID, our advocates have also said that they are seeing an increase in strangulation. And that is a lethality factor. We know when strangulation is present, that is a very dangerous situation for folks and they should be connected to services. So we're broadening our understanding of what constitutes physical abuse. And I see there's lots of things in the chat. We'll get to that once we kind of wrap up these polling questions. Thank you for your engagement and participation. Two more polls for us. Okay, research indicates that this form of abuse occurs in 99% of domestic violence cases. And we have the 6 forms that we briefly mentioned before. Lots of people are thinking about this one, taking your time to answer. This one is a tricky one. Okay, a few more folks to hoping to get full participation. Okay, we're going to end polling and share these results. So many people said emotional. Someone also said verbal. The correct answer here, this is a tricky one, is financial or economic abuse. And so this is research indicates. So research does indicate this, that financial abuse occurs in about 99% of domestic violence cases. I would say that in my experience, emotional abuse also occurs in 99% of domestic violence cases. So we'll give that to the folks who also said emotional abuse. But I want to talk about financial abuse and why this occurs in so many cases. Financial abuse is when an abuser has control over the financial resources, and that is used to create financial dependence. And so this can look like withholding money or taking someone's paycheck. It can also be not giving someone access to the bank accounts or to the assets to even know what kind of financial resources are there. It can also look like abusers preventing their partner from going to work or getting an education. So for example, I've worked with someone who their abuser routinely called them up at work and harassed them, would show up at their work, and because of that, felt like they couldn't continue with their employment because they didn't feel safe. They didn't like having to explain those dynamics to their employer. And their abuser said, well, I didn't really want you working and making money. Right. So that restricting someone from working or from pursuing an education could also be financial abuse. We are also seeing where abusers will ruin a victim's credit behind the scenes without the victim's knowledge. So if they do decide to leave that abusive relationship, they then don't have the resources. It's really difficult when you don't have good credit, right, to do lots of things in our society. So that is something that's really manipulative behind the scenes that victims are experiencing. So that is financial abuse. And our last poll. Which 2 methods of control are closely linked? A few more seconds. Okay, we're going to end polling and share the results. 60% of you said verbal and emotional abuse, and that is correct. So verbal abuse is using words to hurt someone. This can be belittling someone, mocking them, and verbal abuse is closely tied to emotional abuse because emotional abuse happens when someone starts to believe what their abuser is saying about them. Right? So if someone's experiencing verbal abuse and they're told, you're worthless, you're stupid, and no one else is going to love you, they're going to start to believe that. And that's when that becomes emotional abuse. And emotional abuse is actions that damages one's emotional well-being. It often affects one's sense of self or their self-esteem. It affects how they're viewing themselves and possibly their relationship. So emotional abuse can have long-lasting effects on victims. It's very difficult to overcome. And again, it impacts how they're viewing themselves and that relationship. Some tactics that abusers use to do this is often blaming the victim for their own actions. So saying things like, well, if you had dinner ready on time, I wouldn't gotten upset and hit you, right? So this is actually your fault because you didn't have dinner ready in time for me. And again, that victim might start to actually believe that they're to blame for that abuse. With COVID, we've also seen emotional abuse play out with abusers maybe not socially distancing and not caring if they infect the family, particularly if one of the family members or the victim is immunocompromised or at high risk. So we're also seeing emotional abuse tied into COVID dynamics. Okay. So it looks like in the chat, people are talking about how we have to change the culture. You're absolutely right. How we change the culture is starting with education. And we have a really great graphic at the end that talks about how that culture influences domestic violence and certain things in that culture that we can challenge. So we're definitely going to wrap up by talking about that. Someone wrote, how can DVCC assist moms in family court? And I think this individual might have mentioned this before in the chat. I saw it briefly about how abusers often will use the court system as a way to maintain power and control. Abusers will appear like they're the victim, right? And the true victim is made to be seen as the abuser. That is very difficult and very challenging. So it's important that we continue to educate judges in our judicial system about these dynamics of domestic violence. But you are correct that mothers and victims within the family court setting do need help and support because abusers use that system as a way to maintain power and control. Oh, and those were our polling questions. Okay, so now we talked about the methods of control. Nakia is going to talk about how children are used to maintain power and control. And it's really important that we recognize that children are also victims of domestic violence. They are impacted by being in the household. So take it away, Nakia.
Thank you. So just right off the bat from our comment section, children are used as a method of control in family court, right? Abusers will use custody as a way to maintain power and control. So if partner is threatening to leave or trying to leave, the abusive partner will threaten to take custody or to file excessive, filings and kind of tie them up into the legal system, and they will use their children as a tactic. So maybe they will say, there's no way, if you leave me, there's no way a judge is going to give you custody. You don't have a job or you don't have resources. Everything is in my name. You can't even support yourself. There's no way you're going to be able to support a child. Or they threaten to call DCF, and say, if you leave me, then I'm going to call DCF and I'm going to say that you're abusing our child or that you're neglecting our child, right? And especially if the abuse is causing some form of neglect, that is another way that the abuser will maintain power and control by using the children. They can also threaten or harass their partner if there is a visitation agreement set up, and maybe use the children to relay messages to the parent or even spy on the parent, manipulate them to tattle or tell on the parent, which is not only destructive for the victim, but also for the child that is being used in this very manipulative way. They can also threaten to hurt the children or kidnap them in extreme cases, or just make the parent feel guilty about the children. Part of emotional and verbal abuse is belittling. So So belittling their parenting skills, saying that they're a bad parent, that they're a bad provider, doing it in front of the children is also a way to maintain that power and control. So there are many different ways that children are being used, and the results of that are impacted in very different ways. So in the next slide, we want to highlight a couple ways that children are exposed to domestic violence. Now, even if they are not necessarily witnessing those violent acts, they still are aware that it's going on. So perhaps they are feeling the tension that's building up in the home prior to the assault, especially if one parent is walking on eggshells and, they're very, anxious and jittery, and they're trying to keep the kids quiet so they don't upset the partner and set them off. Or they can just tell that there's a lot of stress. It's like a high stress situation. Maybe the abusive parent is, they're making threats beforehand. They don't see the actual physical harm take place, but they are hearing the threats that lead up to it. Or maybe they're seeing the aftermath of it. So maybe after the kids go to bed and the next morning they wake up and, they look around their house and they see broken furniture or broken dishes, or just a mess everywhere from the assault. Or maybe they don't see it, but they're hearing it from upstairs or from behind a closed door, right? Which is still very damaging to the child. Or maybe as a result of the domestic violence, they're being denied care because the parent is too injured or not stable enough. Maybe they're suffering from depression or anxiety in order to take care of the child. And we actually know that in 70% of children exposed to domestic violence are also exposed to child maltreatment, which could be anything from not having enough food or inadequate clothing, not getting the proper medical treatment, right? So if a parent is suffering, maybe the victim is suffering from a black eye, and because of that, they can't go outside because they don't want people to know about the domestic abuse. So they stay home for a couple of days until they can heal. But as a result of that, the child misses, a week of school because the parent is too injured to take them. Or maybe because they are so depressed about the domestic abuse that they aren't able to properly care for the child and make sure the child is getting fed or getting to their doctor's appointment. So it can manifest in a number of different ways. And of course, the extreme examples is if a child is forced to watch the abuse or even participate in abusing their parent, or if they lose a parent due to murder and or suicide. So there are a number of ways that a child can be exposed to domestic violence. It doesn't always just have to be like actually seeing the physical abuse, but it's if they're seeing it, if they're around in that house, it's still having an effect on them, and we want to make sure that people are aware of that.
Okay, so now we're going to do an interactive activity, and based on what's all the engagement in the chat, this activity will also have a lot of engagement. We're going to use the whiteboard feature. If you have not used that feature before on Zoom, it allows us to brainstorm in real time together, like if we were in person and had a whiteboard at the front of the room. And so for this activity, we are going to brainstorm reasons why individuals might stay in an abusive relationship, and then brainstorm reasons why individuals might leave an abusive relationship. And this activity will help us kind of understand how complex domestic violence is, barriers for leaving, and really allow us to have greater empathy for the experiences of victims. So let's start with reasons why someone is going to stay in an abusive relationship. So again, you're going to use the chat box for this. And since I can't easily see the chat box right now, my colleagues are going to let me know what's being said there so I can write it for us.
Okay, so the first one we have financial reasons. So
yes.
finances.
So if someone doesn't have financial resources to leave, then they're going to stay. Great.
kids.
Okay, children. So often victims stay in abusive relationships because they don't want to break the family up, right? They're staying because of their children. Thank you.
Okay, emotional connection or loves their abuser,
Mhm.
and it's hard to leave.
Thank you. I think we forget that victims can love their abusers. We can love people who hurt us, and love is a really strong and powerful emotion. So love keeps people in abusive relationships. And yes, it is hard to leave. It is difficult to make that decision and to possibly pick up your entire life. So thank you for those comments. Any more that are coming
We have
through?
fear of losing custody, trauma bonding.
Mhm.
And then also concerned about what others will think.
Yeah, I think concern about what others will think is a big one. Living in small towns in Connecticut, knowing that people are going to hear about this and possibly talking about it, that's not what people want. And so caring about what others might think, also caring about either the victim's reputation or the abuser's reputation. So if the abuser is well known in that community, the victim might not want to leave because they don't want to let the community know what has happened and possibly ruin that abuser's reputation in the community if they're well known. A fear of losing custody, that will definitely keep someone in this relationship. Anything else coming in?
Let's see. Do you have anyone else that wants to comment? I'm gonna wait another couple of seconds.
One that I always like to talk about is hope. So when we think back on that continuum that Nakia talked about, victims have hope that their abuser will change. They think about those good times or the start of the relationship on the left side of that spectrum. They have hope that their abuser is going to change. Often the abuser has made promises to change and has said that they're sorry for their behavior, right? So victims often have hope. And one more I want to add is fear. Someone had fear of losing custody. I'm also going to say that fear for someone's life. There is lethality in leaving. We know that is the most dangerous time for victims because abusers feel like they are losing control over their partner, and they will go through lethal means to exert that power and control. So for some victims, it is a bigger safety concern for them to leave than it is to stay. So that fear keeps them in that relationship. Also just fear of the unknown, fear of being on your own. And so I think fear really plays into this. Also fear or maybe stalking. So if someone's being stalked by their partner, they might stay because they think that even if they leave, they're going to be tracked down, right? And they're going to be found. Great, thank you for that. We are now going to move to the other side and make a column for reasons why someone might leave an abusive relationship. And again, you can use that chat box. Nakia will shout it out for us. People are thinking.
Okay, feel empowered.
Yeah, they feel empowered. They understand that they deserve better. And maybe they're empowered because they are now connected to resources and have the support that they need. Anything else? I'll add a few more to our list.
Protect their children.
Oh, thank you. So I'm just going to write children.
They lose faith in their abuser. I guess that's the opposite of the hope, right? They no longer have hope that the abuser is going to change. They want to be free from the abuse. They have friend support.
Mhm.
Someone else said someone steps in to help.
Mhm. Okay, so a few things that stand out to me when we do this activity is that often the stay column is much longer than the leave column. So recognizing that there are many reasons why someone would stay in an abusive relationship, many legitimate reasons. Additionally, we also usually see similarities between these two lists. So children is on both of them. So someone might stay in this relationship because of their children, and someone might leave because of their children. And this is why this is complex. That's why every victim's story and experience is unique, because the very reason why someone might stay in this relationship is the very thing that is going to push them to leave that relationship. And victims know the risks and rewards of staying or leaving. As domestic violence advocates, it's our job to explain their options, explain their resources, talk about the safety concerns and considerations, but ultimately victims know the risks and rewards with those options and are empowered to make the best decision for themselves. Okay, so thank you for engaging in that activity. We're going to pop back into our slides. So wrapping up the activity, domestic violence is complex. We know that it takes victims multiple times to leave before they leave permanently. Even so, not all victims will leave the relationship. So it's important for us to talk about how victims often want the abuse to end and not the relationship to end. Again, they often have love for this person, they have hope for their future, they have children together, all those things. We talked about how leaving an abuser is the most dangerous time for a victim. And that's why it's so important that victims are connected to experts and to their local resources like DVCC, so our advocates can explain their options and can help safety plan with them during this time. Okay, take it away, Nakia.
So now we are going to discuss how to help a friend if you or a loved one, if you think that they are experiencing domestic violence at home. It can be very hard and challenging sometimes because it's a very, intimate matter, but it's important if you care about them, if you love them, that you try to intervene in that situation. And there are a number of ways that you can do this. So first, you want to focus on their rights in the relationship and what they deserve, meaning especially if their partner has been verbally and emotionally abusive to them, they're probably getting a constant just stream of you're a horrible person, you're unworthy, no one loves you but me, you can't do anything right. So as a friend, you want to begin to combat that negative talk by telling them that they are worthy and that they are loved and that they're worthy of respect and relationship and they're worthy of being treated as an equal and having a say in what goes on in the relationship, in their future, and in their home. So you just kind of want to begin to build them up as a friend and combat that negative talk that they're getting from their abusive partner. You also want to discuss with them some of the warning signs or red flags. So again, we said that relationships fall on that spectrum from healthy to unhealthy to abusive. So if you are seeing that the relationship is unhealthy, you can definitely kind of start the conversation and say, hey, I noticed that your partner is constantly checking in on you. How do you feel about that? Like, is that concerning to you? Like, what's going on, right? So you just bring up those red flags that you're noticing. Maybe the partner is acting extremely jealous, or you notice that your friend is always having to walk on eggshells. You can definitely start a conversation by just kind of getting their point of view and hearing them out and seeing how they feel about that. And most importantly, you want to spend time with them. A huge red flag that an abusive partner will use is to isolate the victim from their friends and family, to kind of cut off that support system so that they feel like they are completely dependent on the abusive partner. So it's important as a friend or a family member that you still make time and reach out to that person, still check in with them, even if it's, you know, very short and minimal. They still at least know that they have that lifeline and they have that support system for when they are ready to leave the relationship. So those are just a couple of things. And in the next slide, so here's some sample scripts that you can use. So if you're talking about what they deserve in the relationship, you can say, you deserve to be respected and to have your thoughts and opinions valued, right? Or if you're pointing out a red flag, you can say, you know, I've noticed that they always text you and want to know where you are. How does that make you feel? Do you feel like you have your own space and time? And then that can kind of start the conversation about what's healthy in relationship versus what's unhealthy in relationship. Now, this chart, I really like it because, again, we talked about how an abusive relationship is all about one person having power and control over the other. So on one side of the chart, we have the abuser's tactics and the impact on the victim. And then on the other side of the chart, we have the response to that as a friend and how you can kind of begin to help restore that imbalance of power and control and begin to give the power back to the victim. So if the abuser is using emotional abuse as a tactic and the victim feels like they have no outer resources, you as a friend can discuss the support systems that they have and provide referrals and talk about what their options are for their relationship. Or again, if they're using emotional abuse and the victim feels like they have no inner resources, as in they feel like they have no self-esteem or that they're worthless, then you as a friend can believe them and validate them when they do decide to share with you about the abuse. And you also want to point out their strengths. Oftentimes victims are seen as weak, but I believe domestic violence victims are some of the strongest people I've ever met, because the stuff that they are able to endure and still survive and still maintain their lives and take care of themselves and their family, it's incredible. So they are not weak people. They are extremely strong, that they are able to continue living and fighting for themselves. So remember to point those strengths out to the victim. Again, if they're suffering emotional abuse and they're feeling guilty, especially if their abusive partner is constantly telling them that it's their fault and that they're to blame and that they wouldn't have had to hit them or do this or do that if they had just, you know, listened to them. You want to discuss with the victim the different dynamics of domestic violence and how they use that guilting and shaming as a method of control. And you want to reiterate to them that it's not their fault. It's not their fault that they're being abused. It's the abuser's fault. They have the power to stop, and they are just making those choices not to do that. Some more ways: if the abuser is using physical abuse or threats and the victim is in fear of their safety or of their life, you again want to remind them as a friend of their rights that they have in the relationship, but also you want to refer them to domestic violence agencies like the Domestic Violence Crisis Center so that they can speak to a professional to help safety plan. Anne mentioned before that the most dangerous time in an abusive relationship is when the victim is trying to leave. So it's really important that they are able to talk to someone and safety plan and come up with a strategy of how they're going to safely exit the relationship, so that they have all the resources available and know all the risks going into leaving the relationship. Or if an abuser is using making them the point of reference, and the victim feels like they have no control and that they always have to refer to the abuser because they're always right, you again want to talk to them about safety planning and just let them know that they have power over their own life. We want to build our friends and family members up again, and it starts by allowing them the freedom to choose whether they want to stay in the relationship or not. So as hard as it is sometimes to want to say, not to say just leave, like just stop being with them, just walk away. we are still kind of telling them what to do, and it's not allowing them the freedom in their own life. So all you can really do as a friend is just be there to support them when they are ready to leave, and just in the entire way, just build them up again and empower them. But ultimately, it's their decision, and that's how we're going to get it back.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you so much, Nakia. It's so difficult to help and support someone who you love who is experiencing domestic violence. Wrapping up, this is our second to last slide. You all were talking about culture and how we have to change the culture. Absolutely correct. And we like to think about domestic violence as this iceberg when we're thinking about culture. So the things at the tip of the iceberg are things that are socially unacceptable, that everyone would say is not okay, that we need to challenge, that abusers need to be held accountable for. We also have things underneath the surface of this iceberg that we don't often see or identify as unacceptable, but they allow this iceberg to be, and they allow the tip of the iceberg to be visible. So we also have to challenge the things underneath the surface. So we have to challenge things like victim blaming. When we hear a friend blame a victim or say, why didn't they just leave? Right? We want to challenge that and talk about those dynamics. We want to challenge the idea that it's a private matter or it's not my business. We want to challenge domestic violence jokes if you ever hear that from someone, and also challenge attitudes that excuse abusers' behavior or always assume good intentions from abusers. So again, we want to challenge the attitudes, beliefs, and actions that are under the surface that kind of lay the way or the foundation for domestic violence and for the things on top of the iceberg. We have a training program on bystander intervention that gives people the tools to intervene, not just at the tip of the iceberg, but also underneath the surface, and how we challenge some of these attitudes. And last, how can you get involved? If this program has resonated with you, if this has energized you to get involved or to do something in your community, there is something for everyone, whether that is volunteering with our agency or another agency, signing up for DVCC's emails to be aware of opportunities that are coming about, whether that's events for months of awareness like October and domestic violence awareness. You can also be in the know about our activities by following us on social media. You can host third-party events. We have one tomorrow night where someone is doing a Zoom cooking class for us. Let's Get Cooking with Kimmy. So if you have a business or a talent that you have, you could do a third-party event to support DVCC. Also, New Canaan has a wonderful resource, the New Canaan Abuse Prevention Partnership, that you could get involved in. They're the local resource doing so much for New Canaan, talking about different forms of abuse. They also have a podcast called Talking About It that this month features our executive director. So there are ways to get involved, and please feel free to reach out to DVCC to get involved, or if you are in need of help and support in your own relationships. So that's all we have. Stacey, are there questions that have been in the chat box that we missed?
I don't see any questions or anything in the chat. Last call for a question. Okay, I don't see anything. So with that, I would like to thank Anne and Nakia for this. Oh, hold on. There's something in the chat. Let me see. Okay, it's thanking you all for joining us. So with that, I would like to thank Anne and Nakia for partnering with us for this wonderful program. And I would also like to thank our amazing executive director, Judy Phillips. She has been quietly in the background helping us with the chat.